On June 7, 1892, Homer Adolph Plessy, a 34-year-old African-American man, boarded a railway car in New Orleans, Louisiana. Plessy's objective was to challenge the constitutionality of Louisiana's Separate Car Act, a segregation law that prohibited blacks from using seats in cars reserved for whites. The train conductor had Plessy arrested and removed from the train. The legal battle to overthrow segregation had begun. By 1896, Homer Plessy's case had made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In the famous Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's segregation law. Separate but equal became the law of the land. On May 17, 1996, scholars and activists from around the nation gathered in New Orleans for a conference to mark the centennial of the Plessy decision. The following are excerpts from the conference presentations that discuss the role of race in American life in the past and present.
It's a great pleasure to be here to deliver the opening talk at this distinguished conference and to be on this panel with two very fine historians of the American South. Many of the papers in the next 2 days will examine the Plessy case in detail. My task here this morning is to offer some historical context for our discussions. What I plan to do is to speak about the Reconstruction era after the American Civil War and then compare it a little bit with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, often called the Second Reconstruction. Both those periods, the First and Second Reconstructions, were times when the rights of black Americans and the role of the federal government in protecting the liberties of citizens came to the forefront of American life. Both periods were followed by eras of retreat from the ideal of equality. The Plessy decision embodied and accelerated the retreat from the First Reconstruction and laid the foundation for the new system of racial inequality which would dominate the South for much of this century. The Second Reconstruction had as one of its foremost aims to eradicate from American life the racial segregation legitimized by Plessy. Now, although I have devoted much of the past 2 decades to studying and writing about the era of Reconstruction, perhaps some of those books are outside. Our salesman here has been telling us. I have no illusions about the fact that many Americans know little about it. A few years ago, the Department of Education conducted a survey of high school seniors to determine what they knew about American history. You've seen these things reported in the press every year or two, and they always discover that nobody knows anything about American history. But in this case, 95% of the students could identify the westward movement. Half of them knew who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." But from there, it was all downhill. But at the very bottom of this list, the subject about which the fewest graduating seniors, only 20%, had heard, was Reconstruction. Having recently published a 600-page book on the subject, I found this a little disheartening. But I soon realized that students were not themselves entirely to blame. Just around that time, this is about 6, 7 years ago, E.D. Hirsch, an educator, so-called, made a lot of money by identifying in his best-selling book, Cultural Literacy, about 1,000 things an American must know to be called literate. To my chagrin, Reconstruction was not on the list. So you can be culturally literate in the United States and never have heard of Reconstruction. But my disappointment eased somewhat when I carefully examined the list and discovered that it included Buffalo, New York, but not Lagos, Nigeria. So that if you are unable to identify the most important city in Africa, you can still be culturally literate. But if you don't know about Buffalo, New York, you fail the test. Now, the fact is, however, that even if we are not aware of it, Reconstruction is still part of our lives a century and a quarter after it ended. Many laws of the era, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, are still on the books, still being enforced. The 14th Amendment, of course, the most important addition to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, remains the focus of numerous cases that reached the Supreme Court. The celebrated lawsuit which originated not too far from here by Paula Jones against President Clinton, or then Governor Clinton, has been filed under a Reconstruction statute prohibiting state officials from conspiring to violate a citizen's civil rights. But I think that research will demonstrate that Congress at that time had in mind the depredations of the Ku Klux Klan, not the acts of which Mr. Clinton was accused in that case. But Reconstruction one could go on about this, but let me talk just a little about the Reconstruction period. It was a period of profound change in all aspects of American life, but let me just try to distill its significance down into two basic categories: the political and economic changes that transformed American society after the Civil War, and particularly as those affected Black Americans. The political changes are easier to describe, but not necessarily well understood. The Civil War, as we all know, not only preserved the American Union, but destroyed the institution of slavery. And the fundamental question that agitated American life in the period after the war was precisely how our society would respond to this momentous fact of emancipation. What system of labor would replace slave labor? What system of race relations would replace the race relations of slavery? What would be the role of former slaves in American civic and political life? These questions became the focus of a tremendous political struggle in which African Americans themselves played a central role by demanding that the nation give substantive meaning to the freedom they had acquired. As a result of this political crisis of Reconstruction, a series of laws was passed that for the first time in American history established the principle of equal rights before the law for all citizens, regardless of race. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, these and other measures declared that Black Americans were citizens of the United States and would enjoy the same legal rights as other citizens. That is to say, the same laws, the same punishments would apply to them as to whites, and neither the government nor places of public accommodation could discriminate against them on the grounds of race. In addition, Black men, although not women, of course, received the right to vote in the South in 1867 and throughout the nation soon afterwards via the 15th Amendment. Now, one can list these important, momentous developments. What's important to recognize, though, is how revolutionary a change in American society these measures represented. Today, it is part of our very nature to assume that all Americans should be equal before the law. This is not to say that African Americans are always treated equally, but legal distinctions between American citizens no longer exist. In the Reconstruction era, this was a completely new idea. There was no precedent for it. The Constitution, which didn't mention the name race, still had that category, other persons, to apply to the vast majority of the Black population. Slavery had been an intrinsic part of the original Constitution. Before the Civil War, both northern and southern states practiced widespread discrimination in law against Black Americans, both free and slave. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled that no Black person could be a citizen of the United States. The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people of the United States." The people, the Supreme Court declared in Dred Scott, meant the white people. That was the law of the land when the Civil War took place. Thus, the establishment in Reconstruction of civil and political equality represented a radical change in the nature of public life in this country. Reconstruction represented a remarkable repudiation of the pre-war tradition that defined America, in the phrase of the time, as a white man's government. It created for the first time an interracial democracy in which rights attached to persons not in their capacity as members of racially defined groups, but as members of the American people. Now, this departure was intimately related to a second profound change, the establishment of the federal government as the main protector of citizens' rights. The laws and amendments of Reconstruction gave the national government the authority to intervene in local and state affairs to protect the basic rights of all American citizens. As with equal civil rights, this is a principle we generally take for granted, although it has been challenged in the last few years. Certainly during the Civil Rights era, it was widely accepted that the ultimate guardian of citizens' rights was the federal government. This principle was established during the First Reconstruction, and again, it represented a repudiation of the previous traditions of American history. Before the Civil War, most Americans, certainly most free Americans, believed that a powerful national government posed a danger to their liberties, that local and state authorities could best protect their rights. The Bill of Rights, added to the Constitution in 1791, rested on the idea that the federal government needed to be restrained from abusing its power. It doesn't restrict what states can do, the Bill of Rights. It restricts the federal government from interfering with freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, etc. The Civil War and Reconstruction reversed this pattern, thus redefining the nature of American federalism. With the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights was now applied to the states. Indeed, the amendment made the federal government responsible for ensuring that the states abide by the Constitution in this respect. The 14th Amendment prohibited states, not the federal government, states, from denying any American the equal protection of the laws or abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens. This broad language opened the door for future Congresses and the federal courts to define and redefine the guarantee of legal equality, a process that has occupied the courts for the better part of the last half-century. Perhaps I can illustrate this point most clearly by just comparing the language of the Bill of Rights with that of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, restrains federal power. What are the first few words? Congress shall pass no law. It restricts what Congress can do. The three Civil War-era amendments all end with a section empowering Congress. Congress shall enforce this amendment with appropriate legislation. The federal government, not the states, had become, in Charles Sumner's words, the custodian of freedom. Now, let me turn briefly to the economic realm, since the problems of former slaves were not obviously simply related to their civil and political status. Most black people came out of slavery impoverished and propertyless. They believed, as I have said, that freedom meant more than simply not being a slave. Along with emancipation, they insisted, should come equal standing in the polity, access to education, autonomy for their families, and ownership of land. Former slaves believed they had earned, through their 250 years of unrequited labor, a claim to land in the South. There were some in the North, most prominently Thaddeus Stevens, the great radical Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, who urged the federal government to confiscate land belonging to former slave owners and give it in 40-acre plots to former slaves. Of course, this did not happen. Most Northerners probably believed it would not be a bad idea if former slaves obtained some land, but they did not think it was the role of the federal government to give them land belonging to someone else. According to the prevailing free labor ideology, individuals should work for wages, save their money, and slowly acquire the wherewithal to purchase land for themselves, a prospect very unrealistic in the conditions of the post-war South for former slaves. Now, by itself, land ownership would not have been a panacea for former slaves. After all, millions of white farmers were losing their land in the last third of the 19th century. But land distribution would have sharply altered the balance of power in the rural South and given the freed people far more choice as to when, where, and under what circumstances to enter the wage labor market. But in the end, most former slaves were consigned to the situation of being propertyless laborers on land owned by whites, often their own former owners. So there was a vast dichotomy between the very real and dramatic political changes and gains of Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction to address significantly the economic plight of the mass of black Americans. What happened in Reconstruction, one might say, is that the political revolution went forward on the basis of equality, but the economic revolution, the transition from slavery to freedom, produced an extremely unequal system of class relations. Now, even the political gains of the first Reconstruction, of course, proved to be temporary. The final abandonment of Reconstruction came in 1877. There followed a long period in which the laws and constitutional amendments, although remaining on the books, did not actually define the conditions of life of blacks in the South. Why did political Reconstruction fail? Why did white Southerners rally against the new governments, and why did the North abandon its commitment to equal citizenship? There are many, many reasons. First, there were charges of corruption corruption against these Southern governments, in which black Americans for the first time held public office. The Democratic Party, then completely controlled by whites, and many Northerners increasingly came to believe that alleged Southern misgovernment, corruption, arose not from a general decline in public morality. This was the period, after all, of the Tweed Ring, the whiskey rings, and other scandals of the Grant administration, but from the inherent incapacity of African Americans. In other words, giving the vote to blacks was said to be the reason for corruption in Southern government. As social Darwinism gained increasing acceptance among intellectuals, journals, and politicians in the North, the Reconstruction ideal of racial equality came to seem a remnant of a romantic and unscientific era. Only a restoration of white supremacy, it came to be believed, could bring good government back to the South. During the 1870s, in addition, the cry of reverse discrimination was raised by Reconstruction's opponents, who charged that black Americans had become special favorites of the law. Somehow, the efforts of the federal government to uplift and protect former slaves came to be seen by many white Americans as a form of favoritism, which in effect discriminated against the white population. President Andrew Johnson played upon this sentiment in his veto messages. The Reconstruction measures, he said, were efforts to aid the black race, that was his phrase, but nothing was being done for whites. Of course, blacks responded it was ludicrous to call efforts to counteract 250 years of slavery special privilege, or, in the language of that day, class legislation. The white race, said one black political leader, have had the benefit of class legislation ever since the foundation of our government. But Johnson's argument, echoed in the 1870s by increasing numbers of Northern Republicans, proved to be a potent weapon in the hands of Reconstruction's opponents. The idea of reverse discrimination dovetailed with a resurgence of localist and laissez-faire ideology, a sense that the federal government had become too powerful, too intrusive, and that power needed to devolve back to the states. And at the state level, too, Reconstruction's opponents charged that public authorities were assuming too many new responsibilities and spending too much money. The Reconstruction governments in the South established the region's first public school systems, provided medical care for the poor, built asylums, other institutions, and sought to promote economic development. All these programs cost money, a great deal of money. After the war, property values in the South were very low. A result of all this, low property values, greater public responsibilities, was that taxes went up. The cry of excessive taxation was a potent weapon against the Reconstruction governments. Southern Democrats insisted their region must reduce the level of expenses, cut taxes, even if it meant gutting social expenditures like education. And finally, of course, there was rampant violence in the South by criminal organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. The inability of local governments to put down violence and the federal government's unwillingness after the early 1870s to intervene to protect the rights of black citizens, all this helped to doom the Reconstruction experiment. Now, in this retreat from Reconstruction, the Supreme Court played a central role. The Plessy decision in 1896 was not a sudden reversal of national policy, but the culmination of a process that had begun during Reconstruction itself. One can list the famous Supreme Court cases from Slaughterhouse to the civil rights cases of 1883, which retreated from the idea of aggressive enforcement of civil rights legislation. By the time the court gave the green light in Plessy versus Ferguson to white Southerners to construct whatever racial system they desired without fear of federal intervention, the 14th Amendment had already become a dead letter in much of the South. Plessy was important not only for what it said, but for what it symbolized about American politics, social thought, and race relations at the close of the 19th century. The 1890s, after all, witnessed the resurgence throughout the country of a racialist outlook that united patriotism, xenophobia, and an ethno-cultural definition of nationhood in a renewed rhetoric of racial exclusiveness. 2 years after Plessy, America's triumphant entry onto the world stage as an imperial power in the Spanish-American War tied nationalism ever more closely to notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority. In speaking for the court in Plessy, Justice Henry B. Brown declared that the 14th Amendment could hardly have been intended to abolish all distinctions based on color, since what he called, quote, racial instincts were inborn and unreachable by law. If blacks construed forced segregation as demeaning, he went on, they had only their own excessive sensitivities to blame. There was no reason people should feel degraded by segregation. It was just they were excessively sensitive. But Brown also referred to whites as, quote, the dominant race, suggesting that blacks had some ground for feeling that they were being accorded inferior treatment. Now, the Plessy case, of course, applied only to a Louisiana law mandating separate cars for railroad passengers. But as Justice John Marshall Harlan predicted in his dissent, segregation, which had already developed informally in many sectors of Southern life, now became a pillar of the region's racial system. Plessy unleashed a flood of legislation affecting institutions from schools to hospitals, waiting rooms to toilets, pay windows to cemeteries. Despite what Harlan called the thin disguise of equality mandated by the separate but equal, or was it equal but separate, doctrine, separate facilities were always unequal and always demeaning. 2 points about the post-Plessy South deserve emphasis, especially in light of a certain nostalgia nowadays for the era of segregation, allegedly a time of strong and autonomous black communities created out of separation. First, racial segregation was a system not of separation, but of subordination. It was part of a complex web of institutions, each of whose elements reinforced the others. Along with segregation went disenfranchisement, inferior education, a labor market with a strict segmentation between white jobs and Negro jobs, unequal justice, the convict lease system, and to enforce the system at its outer boundaries, the use of lynching to silence dissent. So it's not just separation we're talking about, it's an entire pattern of inequality. The second point is that while the South system was far more severe than race relations in the rest of the country, segregation was a national phenomenon, not a Southern phenomenon. Although most Northern states did not require it by law, the practice was pervasive. Even in avant-garde Greenwich Village, New York, for example, where I live or nearby, Paul Robeson could not find a restaurant to serve him lunch when he was working as an actor in the 1920s. That was Greenwich Village, the most liberated part of the country. Nor would it be accurate to describe the federal government as simply abandoning civil rights enforcement. Rather, for most of this century, Washington actively promoted segregation and racial inequality. Woodrow Wilson ordered federal offices in Washington segregated. New Deal programs like Social Security intentionally omitted from coverage domestic and agricultural laborers, the largest job categories for blacks, at the insistence of powerful Southern congressmen chosen by lily-white electorates. Federal housing authorities reinforced residential segregation throughout the country by refusing to allow blacks and whites into the same public housing projects and channeling mortgage loans almost exclusively to white neighborhoods. Thus, when the civil rights movement reached its peak in the 1950s and 60s, its task was not simply to dismantle legalized segregation, but to combat the legacy of decades of discriminatory actions by federal and state authorities, private employers, realtors, educators, and a host of others. I think it was the historian C. Vann Woodward who who coined the phrase the Second Reconstruction to refer to the period from 1954 to the late 1960s. Although history never really repeats itself, the parallels between the two eras are certainly evident. On the political and legal front, the Second Reconstruction was an effort to reinvigorate, to breathe new life into the principles established during the First Reconstruction. The 14th and 15th Amendments were still parts of the Constitution. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was still on the books, as were laws to suppress the Ku Klux Klan. It took the greatest mass movement of this century to force the national government and the federal courts, after 70 or 80 years of looking the other way, to enforce the laws that had been enacted during Reconstruction and, of course, to pass new ones. For this to happen, Plessy and its legal principle of separate but equal had to be discarded, as it was in the Brown decision of 1954, and there followed in 1957, 64, 65, new civil rights legislation. The political gains of the Second Reconstruction have proved to be more permanent than the first. The right to vote is now guaranteed. The edifice of legal segregation has been dismantled, and many areas of our society, from workplaces to universities to the mass media, are far more integrated than was conceivable a few decades ago. On the other hand, numerous and disturbing parallels exist between the retreat from the First Reconstruction and the events of the past generation. One is the role of the Supreme Court. Just as the judicial retreat did not happen overnight in the 19th century, so we have seen in the past 20 years a slow but steady repudiation by the Supreme Court of the idea of aggressive enforcement of civil rights laws and a narrowing of the definition of equality. In the 1980s, the key decisions revolved around economic issues, such as in celebrated cases, the court limited the right to sue to enforce equal treatment on the job. That's the Brenda Patterson case, and invalidated government programs that sought to compensate for past discrimination by allotting a percentage of contracts to minority firms, the famous Richmond case. More recently, controversial decisions have overturned districting plans that seek to increase the number of minority members of Congress, the Georgia case, weakened affirmative action in many cases, and made it easier for school districts to free themselves from judicial orders mandating desegregation. Now, I'm less concerned here with the specifics of each case, some of them may even have been rightly decided, than the general pattern by which the court today interprets civil rights laws in the narrowest possible manner without actually overturning them. Lately, the court has also begun aggressively to reassert the powers of the states and to move away from the broad definition of federal power embodied in the constitutional amendments of the First Reconstruction and the legislation of the Second. As during the first retreat, the court's recent decisions reflect a growing skepticism in society at large about efforts to undo the legacy of 250 years of slavery, now exacerbated by nearly a century of segregation. The demand that the Constitution must be colorblind, hurled by Harlan at the court's majority in Plessy, has now been adopted by conservative jurists like Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia to mean that the 14th Amendment bars taking race into account in any circumstance whatever, as if the 39th Congress viewed attempts to uplift a previously degraded group of Americans as equivalent to the discrimination of the past. The charge, reminiscent of the 1870s, that blacks have become a privileged class before the law, has recently been invoked by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit to prohibit efforts by the University of Texas Law School to increase the number of minority law students. Such language, of course, is not confined to the Supreme Court. Blatant appeals to racism, of course, are not nearly as prominent as 100 years ago, and the Ku Klux Klan is nowhere near the force it was in the 1870s. But just as the Plessy decision rested in part on the alleged scientific fact that race distinctions and classifications are inherent in human nature and cannot be altered by legislation, today scientific racism has reemerged as part of our political discourse, whether in the form of arguments that races occupy a fixed position on the IQ scale, such as in the book The Bell Curve, or claims, advanced most recently by Dinesh D'Souza in his book, that blacks are what he calls civilizationally, if not genetically, inferior to whites. The message of these works is the same as that of the Plessy era. If blacks occupy a subordinate status in society, it is their own fault. Equally prominent today, of course, is the demand that social spending be reduced in order to lower taxes, just as in the 1870s, and that power be shifted from a bloated federal government to states and localities. Taken together, much of our public discourse on race, taxation, states' rights, laissez-faire, and the wastefulness of public spending and the intractability of poverty, all this is eerily reminiscent of the political dialogue of a century ago, the Plessy era. Thanks, Mom. Another key parallel between the first and second Reconstructions lies in the economic realm. Even though the Second Reconstruction achieved a much more permanent guarantee of the basic political and civil rights of African Americans than the first, it likewise failed to confront effectively the economic plight of most African Americans. One has only to look at statistics of unemployment, housing, health, family wealth, and income to appreciate this failure. Of course, the civil rights movement was as aware of the economic dimensions of freedom as were the former slaves a century before. The motto of the March on Washington of 1963, let me remind us all, was jobs and freedom, not, as it is sometimes erroneously asserted today, colorblind laws. But there is a fundamental difference in the economic situation of black America today compared with the era of the first Reconstruction. Then the black community was largely homogeneous. There was a small middle class, but the vast majority were working class former slaves, generally very poor. One of the results of the Second Reconstruction has been a sharp widening of the class differentiation among African Americans, making the problem of assessing economic progress that much more complex. We have witnessed the rise of a large, impoverished underclass, a term I do not like, but that seems to have entrenched itself in our political discourse, as well as severe economic problems for the much larger black working class, hard hit by recessions and the flight of manufacturing jobs from urban centers to rural areas or low-wage areas abroad. But at the same time, a wide spectrum of the black community has benefited enormously from the Civil Rights Revolution and from the affirmative action programs of the 1970s and 80s, now under attack. The number of black professionals and blacks in business has grown apace, as has the proportion of black families earning, say, $50,000 per year or more. This widening gap within the black community makes the task of addressing the economic plight of the underclass and working class much more problematic. But the basic problem evident after the end of the first Reconstruction and all too apparent today is a lack of political will to deal with these conditions. In the presidential campaign of 1992, the plight of much of black America, of unemployment, family breakdown, drugs, children raised in poverty, were simply absent from the political agenda of both parties. Drawing lessons from the past is a hazardous enterprise, but one lesson of both Reconstructions is that rights need to be defended after they are won. As Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who commanded a black regiment in the Civil War, said at that time, revolutions may go backward. The first Reconstruction went backward after being a revolution. The second Reconstruction has begun to go backward as well. Now, I am not offering a sort of anti-Whig account resting on the premise so often heard in our cynical times that nothing has changed. Anyone who grew up as I did, and most of us here did, in the 1940s and 50s knows that things have changed, that American society has changed in profound ways and for the better as a result of the Second Reconstruction. I merely want to emphasize that the struggle to protect these gains continues long after they've been won. This history also underlines the necessity of somehow forcing our society to come to grips with the economic inequalities that lie at the roots of racism. The first Reconstruction, admirable in so many ways, failed to address the economic legacy of slavery. The second, also a great social movement, failed to redress the economic legacy of a century of segregation. Perhaps in the next decade or century, we will witness or even help to create a third Reconstruction, which will take as its agenda not the right to vote, important as that is, not civil rights, but the promise of genuine economic opportunity, which has been denied to Black Americans for most of our history. Thank you.
Now, it's difficult to follow Eric Foner, and this is not the first time that I've had this awkward feeling. After assigning his monumental history of Reconstruction in my own courses in that period at the University of New Orleans, I found that the conclusions of my old lectures have been upstaged, better stated, and more convincingly demonstrated. He would be the first to note that we are here not just to note the parallels between the retreat from Reconstruction and the retreat from our own civil rights era. We are here also to remember the remarkable spirit of resistance that the New Orleans leaders, Black and white, mounted against the reactionary Bourbons of the late 19th century. They may have lost, but it was a struggle worth remembering. Louis A. Martinet, Rodolphe Desdunes, A.J. Goranovich, and Homer Plessy, all those who led the Citizens Committee to challenge the state authorities of Louisiana, were a remarkable little band that need to be remembered. In our times, so similar to those of the 1890s, as Eric Foner has suggested, the Citizens Committee affords us a damn good lesson. We are here primarily to think about the present and the future, and Eric Foner has charted our course that economic decency is the road ahead. But on this centennial, we should take time to remember not merely that revolutions can go backward, but also the lesson of the Citizens Committee, that resistance has results for our own time and for generations yet unborn. Thank you for coming and offering your encouragement to others.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank Lawrence Powell, Julia Burka, and all of the others who have worked so hard for, how long is it, a year, 2 years, to bring this occasion about. We have come to an elegant place to discuss a profoundly disheartening reality. The centennial of the shameful Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision serves as an appropriate reminder of the shameful legacy of racism and bigotry that we not only continue to deal with today, but stand in grave danger of bequeathing to our own children and their children as well. The organizers of this conference deserve our thanks for bringing us to this lovely place and insisting that we devote serious and constructive thought while we're here to an ugly problem. It is equally an honor and a pleasure to be discussing a paper by my colleague Eric Foner. If our fellow citizens remain ignorant about Reconstruction, it's not because Eric has failed to do his part. His magisterial Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, has even managed to instruct an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court on the subject. David Souter cited it in a recent dissent. So it may yet do the same with high school students, the general public, and even E.D. Hirsch. With the hope of provoking discussion this morning, I'd like to offer a few observations, 3 observations, stimulated by Eric's very interesting paper. To make the first one, I must recount something that Eric told me not long ago. Suspecting, no doubt rightly, that our local rag was unaware that this year marks the centennial of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, Eric offered a short article on the subject to the op-ed editor of the New York Times. After looking it over, the editor decided that it was too historical. Perhaps because, like his readers, the editor had never heard of Reconstruction. But he promised to get someone else to produce something on the subject. Not long after our conversation, the article produced by the someone else duly appeared on the op-ed page. Written by a right-wing opponent of affirmative action, it purported to prove that the racist legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson lives on today in the actions of people seeking to use the power of the federal government to counteract the results of racism. Far from fading quietly into history, the author wrote, Plessy's core premise, that the government may classify people on the basis of race, remains alive and well, nourished by the same liberal advocates who once vowed its demise. By that sleight of hand, the author transformed a system of power, exploitation, and oppression into a mere scheme of classification. Millions of victims of torture, rape, lynching, arson, electoral fraud and intimidation, miscarriage of justice, segregation, exclusion from public services and places of public accommodation, convict leasing, cheating by landlords and employers, denials of jobs, schooling, and union membership, and taxation without representation, will be pleased to know, or at least their descendants will be pleased to know, that they were simply the hapless targets of malclassification. But in transforming a system of power into a system of classification, the author of that op-ed article is by no means alone. The language of historians, of sociologists, of journalists, and indeed the conventional public language in which we all discuss these matters, the language of race relations, carries out that same sleight of hand day in and day out. It converts a collective act of forcible oppression into a trait, namely race, of the individuals against whom that act has been carried out. The proper answer to people who, in a sudden access of colorblindness that never afflicted them or their doctrinal predecessors when Negroes were in their proper place, insist that justice must be blind or deliberately blinded to the injustice of the past and must therefore ignore race, the proper answer to them is that it is not race for which we need a remedy, but racism. Our society is necessarily free of race, since race is a bogus notion with no basis in reality or science. It does not follow, however, that our society is free of racism. And you cannot remedy racism while blindfolding yourself, lest your eye should accidentally fall on the victims of racism. My second observation is that in its context of time and circumstances, the first Reconstruction was far more radical than the second. Whatever its limitations in satisfying the aspirations of the former slaves, Reconstruction ranks among the most radical of revolutions. In the wake of the Civil War, slave property was expropriated without compensation to the tune of billions of dollars, and the former slaves were made citizens and accorded not just the right to vote, but also the right to hold public office. Nothing remotely comparable occurred in the contemporaneous or nearly contemporaneous emancipation of slaves elsewhere in the Americas and of serfs in Eastern and Central Europe. The so-called Second Reconstruction, in contrast, appears radical only by virtue of the scale and desperation of the resistance it provoked, which itself pales in comparison to the reaction against the First Reconstruction. The demands of the Second Reconstruction were those of the 19th century, those that Reconstruction had placed on the agenda, and of whose symbolic abandonment Plessy versus Ferguson represents the symbolic culmination. Members of this audience, old, and some of you are, I can see, old enough to remember the civil rights movement, will recall that those activists who proposed to invoke the 14th Amendment's procedure for reducing the congressional representation of states that denied Afro-Americans the right to vote were widely denounced as impractical, if not subversive, militants. Perhaps nothing so vividly illustrates the essential conservatism of the civil rights struggle than that one of its most radical demands was for the literal application of a provision of the United States Constitution, which was regarded as a wild-eyed scheme. Third observation, vital though it was to finish the unfinished work of the 19th century, and I don't intend to minimize that, it was absolutely essential. Any social agenda rooted in century-old unfinished business was bound to leave vital work belonging to its own time unattended. Especially must that be the case when its own time is an era of transformation and upheaval so extraordinary that one recent historian has characterized it as the greatest, most rapid, and most fundamental in recorded history, and as marking the end of the 7 or 8 millennia of human history that began with the invention of agriculture in the Stone Age. For Afro-American people, that transformation has telescoped within the space of a generation their movement into the industrial working class and the relentless destruction of the employment base of that class by automation, robotization, restructuring, and the export of jobs to low-wage foreign markets. But the process, though more intense for Afro-Americans because of the short period over which it has occurred, and because Afro-Americans are more homogeneously working class than virtually any other group, that process has been essentially the same for everyone, and it is wreaking destruction across the board. More than in any previous period of history, the world of capital is global and becoming ever more instantaneously global with every advance of information technology. Meanwhile, human beings remain tied to national and even local entities, entities whose sovereignty has been so eroded that it now extends to little more for national governments than the selection of a flag and a national anthem, and the maintenance of a war-making apparatus, which is perhaps why governments that can do nothing else for their citizens have proven devastatingly effective at enveloping them in barbaric warfare. National currencies lie at the mercy of a few smart alecks sitting at a computer screen, as the British discovered a few years ago when a multi-billion-dollar raid on the British Treasury failed to save the pound from abrupt devaluation. The Keynesian fiscal techniques that governments once used to protect their citizens from the consequences of an untrammeled free market are now punished in the global market, where the demand for competitiveness outweighs every other value, political, ethical, or moral. Our stock market goes into a tailspin every time there is even a marginal decrease in unemployment, and the Federal Reserve System has to step in and take quick action to reverse the situation. Our system, in other words, by structural necessity, treats human beings as disposable objects. As long as that situation prevails, who seriously believes that the resulting scramble for whatever crumbs may become available will not regularly degenerate into all the retrograde forms of bigotry and communal violence that we witness on an ever-expanding scale all around us, included to, but not limited to, racism? Our system rests on an economic dynamic that manifestly and designedly fails to produce justice for the bulk of its citizens, and that is increasingly seen in precisely that light by a growing number of citizens. After all, it is not Afro-Americans who are holing up in ranches and mountain fastnesses, shooting agents of the federal government, mailing bombs to anonymous citizens, or blowing up federal buildings with human beings inside them. the expectations of the white, blue, and white-collar working middle class, or at least what Americans think of as a middle class, nourished by what we now know to have been the extraordinary and unsustainable economic boom of the post-World War II years, certainly rested in no small part on the automatic expectation of those people that they would receive racist preferences that would automatically secure for them life's bounties, whether college admissions, apprenticeships, jobs, union membership, housing and business loans, public services, or whatever, and that they would receive these ahead of people of African descent. But today's free market, a market whose freedom has a higher priority for most governments than the freedom of human beings, cannot secure white people an untroubled expectation of these bounties, even if every single person of African descent in the country should be denied them. That is the reality for which we will either find a solution or go down in flames as a society and as a civilization. The problem, in other words, is justice, not racial justice, which is not a form of justice at all, but a form of injustice, just as a half-truth is not a type of truth, but a type of lie. Assuredly, those questions go far beyond the issues of Plessy versus Ferguson. But is that not as it should be? After all, Plessy versus Ferguson, as the organizers of this conference have reminded us, was 100 years ago. Thank you.